Hello, it looks like we're live now.
We are.
Welcome, Rolly. My name is Betty. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen. I am the director of the Brisbane French Festival, and it's my great honor today to welcome you for the first of our cultural webinars. So I will be introducing Rolly in a second, who will be our first guest speaker. But first of all, I'd like to explain how this is all going to work. So you can hear us and you can view us. But if you want to have any questions, please feel free. Sorry, that's hard. It's a hard start on a Monday morning. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them down in the chat area, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. So we will be taking questions at the end of the presentations and asking Rolly all the wonderful things you want to know about him. So you may have heard about Professor Emerit Rolly Essex. I have met Rolly when he was the president of the Alliance Française here in Brisbane, and I was part of the board for 10 years. But you may have read Rolly's column. He has been writing in the Brisbane Courier Mail since 2006. Is that correct, Rolly? It's been a
long time.
A weekly column, and you also have a talk show on ABC Radio. So people may have heard a word in your ear, which has been broadcasting for since 1997. Mm-hmm. Professor Rolly Essex has been awarded the Medal of Honor from the Australian government in 2012, and we were really happy when he was also honored the Chevalier des Palmes Académiques by the French government in 2017. So Rolly is specialized in language, culture, and society, and now is also specializing in pain and health communication, leading a research group with University of Queensland investigating the use of language in the diagnosis, treatment, and management of pain. So that's all extremely interesting. Rolly has got a huge biography. It's been, doing so many things for the study of French languages, mostly Russian, I shouldn't say French. And now Rolly is going to do a presentation on how the French language has influenced the English language for years. And vice versa. So we're all excited to hear from you. So welcome, Rolly, and it's all yours now.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see if we can make this work. I think we're ready to begin the presentation. First of all, thank you, Betty, and thank you everyone for attending Le Festival in a triumph of technology over infection. We've actually managed to make connection with lots of people like this, and I'm really pleased to be the first speaker in this section of marvelous talks that they've been organizing. So here we go. I'm going to start the presentation and we'll see if we can make it go. Right. So centrifugal, centripetal and archipelago. 3 epochs in the pas de deux of French and English. I'm interested in the way the languages have influenced each other back and forth over the centuries. And I'm going to be saying that one of them is centrifugal, one of them is centripetal. And there's a really interesting story which has gone on between French and English over the last 1,000 and some years. We begin with Melvyn Bragg, Lord Bragg actually, who wrote a book and did a TV series called The Adventure of English, The Biography of a Language. That's a remarkable title because can a language have an adventure? And in particular, can it be a person to have a biography? And as a subsequent question, could you imagine an aventure de la langue française? Keep that in mind, please. We are going to come back to aventure a little bit later. What Bragg says at the start of his book is that he talks about what was to become English's most subtle and ruthless characteristic of all, its capacity to absorb others. Capacity to absorb others. So English is centripetal. It grabs material from all over the place and includes it in a growing bag of things which are English. French, on the other hand, as I'll talk about a little bit later, is centrifugal. It's a center point radiating out wisdom and beautiful language from the Quai de Conti, which is the home of the Académie Française in Paris. Let's go back to Old English first. This is the way it was spelt at the start. And in the 5th century, the Celts and the Picts were having a bit of trouble in England. They invited the Angles, the Saxons and Jutes to come across and help establish order. And the Angles spoke Anglish or English, and that's where the name of the language comes from. They got to England and they said, oh, this is very nice, we're going to stay. And so they pushed the Celts back into Scotland and Ireland and Wales and took up residence. And we know about this because of the history of the English-speaking people by Bede, who was a divine who wrote a marvelous work in Latin in the 7th century. Around about this time, King Alfred ascended the throne and began a tradition of English literacy, English language, translations, and Old English was starting to look really quite strong and promising until 1066. That was the year of the Norman conquest, when William the Conqueror defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and Norman French became the dominant language of English for the next 300 years. So there was a big break put on Anglo-Saxon literacy. Looking ahead over some of the main anchor points of English over the next centuries, after 1066, English entered a period when it was not the major language of the court or of the church. The church used Latin, the court used Norman French, and English was more like a trading language used by ordinary people. Until you get to Chaucer in the 14th century. He died in 1400, author of the Canterbury Tales. And probably more important for the language, in 1476, Caxton set up his printing press in London, and that helped to consolidate the norms of English around southeast British English. Over the years that followed, well, in the 16th century, the marvellous Bible translations with people like Tyndale. Shakespeare was born in 1564. And of course, in 1611, the King James Bible, which was one of the most important monuments in the growth of English. But it's interesting to reflect that Isaac Newton, the man who discovered gravity, wrote his book on mathematics in Latin, but his book on optics in English. And this is a very important moment because it in fact says English is a good enough language to do science in, and so it had reached a point of maturity. 1755 was the first big dictionary of English by Johnson, and 1919, I'm going to come back to later, the Treaty of Versailles was the first major international treaty which was not written only in French, but also fateful language in English. Here is John Bull, perhaps a little later than 1066, and this is what happened to him in the centuries following the Norman conquest. Because the French brought with them the language of court and law and business, and they brought a whole lot of vocabulary from Norman French, which have taken root in English in various ways. For example, the word guarantee ended up in English as warranty, and Guillaume came William. So the parallelism was established in borrowed words. At this time, English got words like castle, attorney, finance, jail, jury, lieutenant, parliament, and lots more. You can see that these were fundamental to the way in which English was able to become an administrative language later on. David Crystal, the British linguist, has estimated that by the end of the 13th century, more than 10,000 French words had taken root in English, and of these, more than 75% are still in use today. In other words, in about 200 years, French had established a beachhead in English which was never to be taken away, and that is still with us. They also gave us some very interesting and characteristic features of English. To begin with, Latin and Greek words, which French already was adopting, belong to the high technical and intellectual areas. French occupies a middle level of educated and stylish usage, and English is the concrete everyday language. So if you have a beer with friends, you have a hearty event. If you have shall we say, a sherry with friends at a cocktail party, it's a cordial event. But if you then have a heart attack, that is a cardiac event. The cordial comes from French, the card bit comes from Greek. And so in English, you've got 3 layers of vocabulary. Germanic English for hearty, Romance for cordial, Greek for cardiac. And this, in fact, establishes a pattern which German just entirely overlooks, The word for heart in German is Herz. If you have a cordial sherry, it's herzlich. And if you have a heart attack, it's a Herzinfarkt. For tooth, well, tooth is a good Germanic word. It's English. But dental comes from French, and periodontist comes from Greek again. Sometimes there are only two, like finger and digital. And in a very famous piece of prose, the novelist Scott, Sir Walter Scott, in a novel called Ivanhoe in 1820, noted that all of the names for farm and hunting animals came from Anglo-Saxon English, like ox and bull and cow and pig and sow and sheep and deer. But the names for the meat that you ate came from French: beef, pork, mutton, and venison, all of which suggest that English cooking in those days had already fallen somewhat behind the French. Here are some more examples. Pairs of words like lively and animated. The one on the left is Germanic, the one on right is French or French-derived. Reach and arrive, shame and disgrace, mild and gentle, napkin and serviette, and very characteristically, flat and apartment. Apartment has now taken the top end of the market. A friend of mine who is a real estate agent says that an apartment has a jacuzzi and a view and 4 bedrooms, and a flat does not. So, if you like, the English word has become the concrete, less prestigious one, and the French one has become the more prestigious. You get near synonyms like unlawful and legal. Unlawful is not in terms of the criminal code, illegal certainly is. And we get features of word order like governor general, where the adjective general comes after the noun, or body corporate, or actually in law there's a lovely phrase, fee simple. And all of these strange word orders with the body second show the influence of French. Interestingly, however, in modern English, the first 100 most common words are all Germanic. In other words, they come from the deep roots of English, from Old English. Some of them are Scandinavian because the Danes invaded part of Britain and were given control of something called the Danelaw in the northeast. And they actually contributed words like they and are, which are quite remarkable because you don't expect pronouns and parts of speech like ordinary verbs to be borrowed. Of the next words, the first Romance word comes in at 105th position, which is just, and 107th, which is people. So you see that the core vocabulary of English is in fact English, but look at this. I did a quick check of the Oxford English Dictionary looking for suffixes, and you can see why almost all of the abstract vocabulary of English is derived from French. TION, 6,200 of them. We're talking about 45,000 words here out of a vocabulary, say, in the Macquarie Dictionary of around about 112,000 words. And as you run down SION, AGE, a word like curtilage, which I really like from French, it's a legal term meaning your house and the space of land out to the nearest fence or wall. All of the nouns in MENT, in ANT and ENT, we don't need to go through them, but you can see this astonishing donation of French to the, if you like, the conceptual vocabulary of English. So that in modern English, apparently 75% of our vocabulary comes from elsewhere, especially 29% from French, 29% from Latin, but a good part of that came through French anyway. Only 26%, about a quarter, is Germanic, and other bits and pieces, words like chow mein, dim sum, sushi, honcho, and so on. English has become, as I put at the top of the screen, a cheerful mongrel language, a word which the French would never apply to their own. So the common vocabulary and grammar of English are Germanic, and in English you would say they caught the thug in front of the house. But a policeman reporting that in more elegant language would say we apprehended the miscreant in front of the domicile. And those words, as you know, come from French. The presence of French was resented by a lot of English people. Addison set up the first English newspaper, The Spectator, in 1711. And in this quotation, he is regretting that there aren't any, and I've underlined it for you, the superintendents of our language, to hinder any words of a foreign coin from passing among us, and in particular to prohibit any French phrases from becoming current in this kingdom when those of our own stamp are altogether as valuable. Addison, being a journalist, was well aware of that enormous contribution of French, and he had a real complaint in this piece, which actually is a bit unkind. When we have won battles, which may be described in our own language, why are our papers filled with so many unintelligible exploits, and the French obliged to lend us a part of their tongue before we can know how they are conquered? Not very kind, Mr. Addison, but the sentiment is true. These are, if you like, French words being put into use in the language. Johnson did his dictionary in 1755. He always claimed that it was one Englishman in 7 years producing a dictionary of 43,000 entries, which I will compare to you shortly to the Académie Française. It wasn't quite true because he had a lot of help. But he did write in his preface, "Those who have been persuaded to think well of my design will require that it should fix our language." In other words, English was a fermenting mess, and people wanted him to actually say what's in and what's out, and to put a stop to those alterations which time and chance have hitherto been suffered to make in it without opposition. With this consequence, I will confess that I flattered myself for a while, but now begin to fear that I have indulged expectation which neither reason nor experience can justify. Expectation, reason, experience, justify. Look at the French words, will you? Churchill knew very well the value of talking to his nation in ordinary, concrete English language, and that's what he did in the famous speech about we shall fight in France. But if you look at the red words here, these are the ones which come from Romance sources, and we are down to only 8%. The odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air, and so on. A great bit of rhetoric, a very important speech, but one which deliberately takes refuge, if you like, in short, concrete English words, much more than is common in the language of his time, or for that matter, in the language when Johnson was doing his dictionary in 1755. All right, let's jump over to a parallel study of French, which has a history which is much more linear, much more tidy, much more orderly, much more managed, because French from about 1539, certainly from 1600, became the dominant language of Europe. And it had what they modestly call a mission civilisatrice among the various peoples of Europe. After 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles, French began a long decline, and especially after 45. But in the 16th century, with the Ordonnance de Villers-Cotterêts, French was ruling, and François I declared that the language of France was French. It was not Occitan, which is the early Provençal language, which had a huge literature, by the way. It wasn't Latin, it wasn't Breton, it wasn't any of the other varieties spoken in France. It was French. And from that moment, particularly after Du Bellay did the Défense et illustration de la langue françoise in 1549, French set itself on a path to becoming the elegant language with status, and the people who wrote for the Pléiades, for example, gave it the real body which made it, without any doubt at all, the dominant language of Europe. In 1635, the French set up the Académie by Louis XIII and Richelieu. They weren't the first. The Italians had set up the Accademia della Crusca in Florence. Their language was in a comparable mess with lots of dialects. But the Académie very quickly took control. And in 1694, it produced the Dictionnaire de l'Académie, which since that time has become the touchstone for where you go to find out what is in French and what is not. By the way, it took 40 people 55 years and 18 years of revision. Johnson was not slow to say that an Englishman had done it in 7 years. Well, all right, he had at least the model of the Academy Dictionary to use to know exactly how these things were put together. The mission of the Academy is very specific. And this is Article 24 of the statute. La principale fonction de l'Académie sera de travailler avec tout le soin et toute la diligence possible à donner des règles certaines à notre langue et à la rendre pure, éloquente et capable de traiter les arts et les sciences. Remember Newton writing a book on optics in English? Here are the French saying, our language is good enough to deal with anything. And from this point on, you have a sort of citadel French. It is the language of a great monolith, which is prescriptivist. It lays down what is in the language. And sometimes, by the way, it is proscriptivist, that which may not be said. And it is centrifugal. From this quay in the Quai de Conti in Paris, disseminates the model of French everywhere around the world. The French, in fact, invented language planning, which is part of modern sociolinguistics. They didn't call it that, and they didn't actually use these terms, but by doing it, they laid the entire discipline of modern language management and planning, which has three parts. Corpus planning, you control and manage the forms of the language. Status planning, you make absolutely sure that it has the right profile and authority where you want it to do. You position it politically, and you also manage education in the language. And the French did all of these with enormous efficiency and skill. So with corpus planning, they laid down the forms and usage in terms of dictionaries, grammars, orthography, which is how you spell it, and orthoepy, which is how you pronounce it. And they established the language as an instrument of national identity and homogeneity. The English were way, way behind. Starting with the Ordonnance, which I've talked to you about, and du Bellay and the Academy, the French had the instruments which were going to make the language the core part of French identity. Because through superior practice by literature, people like Corneille, Racine, Molière in the 17th century, Diderot and the Encyclopédie in the 18th, they established French as being the model of clear, elegant and expressive language. And poor old Henry IV, who was a Gascon, actually had to have pronunciation lessons so that he would produce spoken French in a language which was consistent with the norms which had been laid down. French was monocentric, by which I mean it had a single center where people looked for the model, and it was managed through the Académie. In terms of status planning, in other words, where the language is in terms of profile in France, it's worthwhile recollecting that in 1789, 50% of the population of France couldn't speak French. Only half the people could. And even in 1871, only 25% had French as a native language. Well, in the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, Article number 2 says, without any beating about the bush, la langue de la République est le français. There is nothing in the American Constitution, in the Australian Constitution, which says anything about language. There is, of course, in Canada, English and French. In New Zealand, it's English, Maori, and sign language. But the French laid this out as a, if you like, an item of belief. And by using language in this way, they used it as a means and a method of achieving national unification, identity, citizenship. Was it elitist? Yeah, and they were quite unashamedly supportive of this idea. And they did it extraordinarily well. They also established the notion in Europe that a language could actually be an ideology, a sort of national monument. And so the French language, if you like, stood as one of the pillars of the French state, something which people identified with in terms of nation and nationhood. And this notion of language ideology was imitated in many countries, particularly in Central Europe, places like Poland, Hungary, in Russia, the Baltic states, the notion that you could use language as, if you like, a pillar of your identity was a French discovery, and the French did it better than anyone else. As a result, of course, non-standard varieties of French were somewhat downgraded. So Corsican, Breton, which is a Celtic language, Gallo, Basque, which is a completely different language family, Franco-Provençal, Occitan, Catalan, all of these were not native official languages in the way that French was, there has been some difficulty with the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages of 1992, which basically says if you speak a language in a polity which belongs to the EU, you have a right to exercise it. The French have signed this but not ratified it. And so as a result, French still maintains its very dominant single position within France itself. Overseas, of course, French was the language that really cut all the mustard that there was in diplomacy and culture and politics. If you were anybody, you learned French, and you did it very well. Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet, had French as his first language. He learned Russian from his nanny when he was 8, and Turgenev, author of Fathers and Sons and other really important prose works in Russian, learned French first and did a lot of his thinking, as he said, in French. French became the co-language of Canada, a language of the Pacific, a language of many cultures in Africa. And of course, it's part of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, with 84 member states and a very important role internationally. French is, and these are numbers that come from Macron, I'll talk about him later, the second language in Europe, the third most spoken in the EU, after German, the third on Amazon, the fourth on the web, and there are 136 million speakers of French as a first language. There are, by the way, anticipations that the number will be closer to 700 plus million in the next 30, 40 years. It's the second language of 84 more million. It's used in 57 countries, 5 continents, and is the official and unofficial language in 29, even though it's only 2.5% of the world population. And in language and education, the French, of course, have been extremely efficient in organizing the culture and education of the French language. FLE is the French language comme langue étrangère, a bit like ESL, English as a second language. And in 2001, Jacques Lang, their Minister of Education, a Frenchman with a name like that, recognized bilingual education in France. And of course, overseas, the Alliance Française and the Institut Français have been extremely powerful in promoting the idea and the content of French itself. French, as we all know, is present in many international organizations, the International Court of Justice. In the Olympics, it's one of the 2 official languages, which recognizes the role of the Baron de Coubertin, who in 1896 was the person who revived the modern Olympics. But there were black clouds. Bismarck, the German Chancellor, was asked late in the 19th century what the dominant country of the 20th century would be, and he said the USA. And he was asked the dominant feature of that dominance, and he said they speak English. As I've told you, in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was in French and in English, and the rise of America was, if you like, the blackest cloud from the point of view of French. Because English, over the years, had been absorbing others with great avidity and efficiency, and at the same time, the French had developed an enormous allergy to Anglicisms. Contamination is a word that was often used. Le Weekend turned up in French as early as 1926, and there were various scandalous works like Parlez-vous franglais, René Etienne, in 1964. This was starting to get evident even then. When the Sony Walkman came out, they didn't call it the Sony Walkman, they called it a baladeur, from the verb balader, meaning to wander around. But then Nerrière, a Frenchman working for IBM, an American company, produced Globish, which is a cut-down version of English with 1,500 words as a means of international language, lingua franca, and communication. The French became very aware of aggressive Anglo-Saxon elements. Remember Du Bellay and the Défense de la langue françoise? And things, I'm afraid, got a great deal worse, and you can see why. Here are some examples. I won't go through them all, but I want to give you some instances of English vocabulary which have turned up in French in ways which suggest that these aren't just borrowed words, but English has got under the skin of French in a very intrusive, possibly destructive way. Trainers are called basket, or basket montante if they're high, and remember they're feminine because they assume the chaussure. So at least gender has reasserted itself in French. But then you get words like catch for wrestling. Now, what's happened here? It's an English word, but it designates something which is not part of the meaning in English. Right? Slip for underpants or briefs, stop for hitchhiking, snob for follower of fashion. These are examples which the French took on using English roots, but they applied meanings which are not part of English. There are many shortenings of English words like le foot for football, of course, golf for a golf course, which once again suggests that the French have taken on some of the English talent for absorbing and adapting and making things French, even though they're no longer part of the core of the French that the French people inherited from the 16th century. The suffix man, sportsman and cameraman, okay, those are words in English. But what about tennisman and rugbyman or recordman? None of which are part of English, but are now features, and they show that the French can in fact construct words, compound words with multiple roots, which are not actually part of English. The ing suffix for lifting, zapping and shopping, and perhaps for locations like un dancing and camping and so on, you get the idea that the English presence is, I think we can use the word insidious, because these are, parking is a word which is present in French, in English, but not in that sense in English at all. Not to mention smoking for a dinner jacket, or training for a tracksuit, shampooing for a substance, or footing and forcing for activities in sports, which are not part of English. By the end of the 20th century, the French had started to have enough, and they passed the Loi Toubon, which basically says if a French journalist in particular uses an English word where there is a particularly appropriate French one, they can be taken to court and fined. And they are, and this happens. On the other hand, Seligman in the French Parliament said, vous voulez édifier une sorte de ligne Maginot de la langue derrière laquelle le français serait à l'abri d'intrusions étrangères. And they talked about the gangrène du français parmi les termes étrangers. So there was a certain, and I must say, I think it's justified, xenophobia for foreign terms, so that, someone selling you a car will offer an airbag, whereas the official term is a coussin gonflable. Unfortunately, the English one is shorter. And if you look at the frequency of these words from modern French, you'll see that they're also, I'm afraid, far more frequent. Enter the hero, none other than the French president himself, Monsieur Macron, who, on the 20th of March 2018, visited the Académie Française. He is not only the president of the Republic, he's the president of the Academy, and he visited on the occasion of the Journée Internationale de la Francophonie. And you can imagine what it would be like if an English head of state actually turned up to talk to an academy. Well, the English don't have an academy. They tried to get one in the 18th century and then again in the 19th, but the Americans and the Brits couldn't work out who was going to have it, so that fell through a hole in the wall and never happened. But in particular, a head of state addressing a national language regulator, which is what Macron did, and he came to read them the Riot Act about corpus planning, status planning, and language and education planning. He talked to them about redefining francophonie in terms of the role and place of the language, its cultural functions, its geopolitical and economic positioning, and its influence and status. And he did so in a very, very interesting piece, which, by the way, you can find on the web. Just do a search for Macron Academy 2018 Discours, and you'll get the entire text which is available. It's a beautifully written, beautifully executed piece of French in the best tradition of the French education system. But this is what he had to say. First of all, he said quite clearly, French is in trouble. He only mentions English 3 times, but when he talks about a combat, which he mentions 11 times, or bataille, he literally means it's time to go into struggle on behalf of the language. But the language that he uses for French is quite distinctively different. He talks about partager. This is not the unique monolithic French of the past, but a language which is shared with others. Intranquille, plurilinguisme is a term he uses a lot. This is not unity French. This is distributed French. And he talks a lot about the French of West Africa, as well he should, because that is going to be the engine room of the expansion of French in the next decades. In the past, Francophonie, as in this diagram, had French right in the middle, and the Francophonie was the periphery, everything else outside. Imagine now that the center part has been erased. Francophonie covers the whole thing, and French no longer has a privileged position right in the middle. It is one of other influences in a total international representation of the language. So the president is saying old models won't do any longer. He talks about the fact that French and France, according to him, have perdu de vue the real role of the language, and he wants to find a fierté retrouvée. And in particular, he talks about an immense aventure de la langue française. Who was it but an Englishman at the start of this talk, mentioning the adventure of the English language? I'm afraid maybe Macron has not actually been reading Lord Bragg, but he's picked up some of the discourse. Because French is now supranational and decentralized. And he says, le français s'est au fond émancipé de la France. French has become emancipated from France. It's become this langue monde, a world language, which is true, a langue archipel. What a marvelous metaphor. Because an archipelago is a series of languages a series of islands, which are discontinuous, but connected by geography underneath, and which on the surface share certain important things, which for him are French values like community, liberty, and resistance. He talks about French as a langue d'échange, a language that people can do for international communication, as a lingua franca, which of course it has been, although, by the way, franca does not mean French at all. He talks about MOOCs, which are CLOM in French, cours en ligne ouvert et massif. MOOC is a massive open and online course. He talks about things like Agence France Presse, which of course is an enormous and very prestigious French contribution to international journalism. And when at Davos he talks in English, he talks about capacité à parler la langue de l'autre. He can do it, he can talk English, the English can't talk French. And in fact, it's worthwhile remembering that as far as I know, the only Australian Prime Minister who's been able to talk in another language was Mr. Rudd, who delivered a talk in Chinese in Beijing when he was Prime Minister. How many heads of state of English can you recollect who speak French? Well, Tony Blair had some, but it wasn't a patch on the English spoken by Mr. Macron. And here he talks about plurilingualism, French as a catalyst or crossroads language. He also talks in status planning terms about joining the Alliance Française and the Institut de France. And at Villers-Cotterêts, they're going to rebuild the chateau as a laboratoire de la francophonie, so that the francophonie doesn't simply wait for people to approach it, but rather reaches out, pouvoir toucher de nouveaux publics, aller vers ceux qui ne viennent pas à nous. So this is an entirely new profile, positioning of French in relation to other languages. With language and education, he talks about the quality of education and he puts money behind his words. He talks about teachers and schools and libraries and the value of excellent pedagogy. He talks about French for refugees, especially women. That's a powerful point. He talks about French as being a portal to France and the French community internationally, and French as a language which is creating opportunities for those who need access to the things which France already carries. Overseas, he talks about doubling the number of students in the lycées, schools and universities, and in tertiary education in France, he talks about doubling the numbers of overseas students in French itself. France, remember, is the number 4 country for attracting foreign students. Number 1 is the USA, number 2 is Britain, number 3 is Australia, number 4 is France, and France is doing very well. In terms of international status, he's very well aware that the big competition comes from English, Spanish, and Chinese. But French as a langue d'échange, he sees as having a very important international role, but it's different because in this profile of francophonie, France now becomes a minority shareholder in a community of maybe 5, 6, 700 million people, speakers of French. And the major numbers of those are going to be in Africa and are going to be second language speakers of French, people like me. It's now possible to talk about langue plural française. There is already a journal called World Englishes. And there are terms like Alger franc, Algerian French, Congo franc, Congo French, in parallel to Singlish, Singapore English, and Chinglish, Chinese English, and so on. And the president was asking the Academy quite deliberately to become an instrument of pluricentric policy, something which in 1635 would have been totally unthinkable. We can try and pull all of this together with a couple of columns of characteristics: French before Macron's discours, and English. So as I've said, French was centrifugal, spinning out things from a coherent central role. English was centripetal, hoovering up stuff from all across the continents. French was monocentric. It had a single established point of prestige. English was pluricentric. There were prestige models of English in Britain, in America, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, in Jamaica, in Canada, lots of other places. French, diglossia means different numbers of languages or varieties. English has always been diglossic, lots of different varieties. Remember Harold Wilson, a prime minister who talked Yorkshire English. The French prime ministers and presidents tend to be normaliens, and they talk that exquisite variety of French, which I love very much, which is elitist and definitely not diglossic. French has had defined edges. The Academy made sure that people knew what was in and what was out. English has had fuzzy edges. The language had grey bits and, if you like, overlaps between American and British and other. French was centralized from the Quai de Conti. English was decentralized with many different locations. French was normative and prescriptive. The dictionnaire said, this is how you should use the language. English gets its norms in use from what people actually do in practice. The French purified their language. The English learnt to live with a lot of, if you like, unwashed washing in terms of what was in and what was out on the edges of the language. French was projected as being homogeneous, and until the 19th, particularly 20th century, it was. English was pluralistic. French was self-contained. English was permeable. French was monolithic. English was multidimensional. French was top-down. In other words, it was managed from a central core. English was bottom-up, made by the use of people around the world. In 2018, Monsieur Macron not only addressed the Academy, but he went to the Collège de France. And he addressed them, and worse still, in a tweet shortly thereafter, he uttered this phrase: La démocratie est le système le plus bottom-up de la Terre. I'm afraid that Lord Bragg and the aventure de la langue anglaise have arrived with the French. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolly. I think that was absolutely fascinating. We've all learned a lot of things. Every time Rolly is on the radio, I have to say I'm fascinated, and I'm glad to tell you that everything is available on podcast by the ABC as well. So if you like today's presentation, you can listen to Rolly all day long today as well. We've had a few questions. Yeah, you can't hear, but I just want to thank the 75 people who've joined us today to listen to you live streaming. We have a couple of questions, and one of them is from Brigitte. Brigitte said, I've always wondered what was the origin of the French word aujourd'hui.
Oh, au is the preposition. Jour is a day, and nuit is an old form of this. So at this day, it's an old form of French which has persisted. And like many other things in French, once established and blessed by the Academy and the dictionary, they're not going to change. By the way, in English, we used to have a word. Now, the Americans don't have a fortnight. They talk about 2 weeks. But we used to have another word in English, a se'nnight, which was a 7-night thing for week. That's fallen out of use. French words, once established, have a much better chance of persisting. The Academy makes sure.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. It's interesting because recently with the coronavirus situation, there's so many words that appeared in the French language, and some of them really make me smile every time I hear them on the news, because the covidio et the coronial, les coroniales, comme on les appelle, are actually English words. So they're the covidiots and the coronials.
Except,
and
of
they
course,
probably think they're French words.
Yeah, well, but it's also consistent with the rules of French. Covidio could be perfectly easily French. And maybe the English borrowed it from the French as well. Who knows?
Probably.
Yeah.
I think our favorite would be the Skypero and the Apero Zoom. I think that was very popular on Friday nights during the lockdown, but it's quite interesting. And if I can just say, just for you, Rolly, Jack Lang to me was the big fellow. He was the Premier of New South Wales a long time ago. Our minister is Jacques Lang. Even though it's spelled as Jack, we call him Jacques. It's interesting to see all those words that came up into the chat. Footing is an interesting one, because we go for footing in our jogging in French. So that doesn't make any sense when you speak English, but it's quite a good one. Giratoire as well, rond-point.
Yeah.
So what do you call them? Is there a rond-point or in English, or just a normal runabout?
Just roundabout, I think.
Just runabout, okay. So Roselyne was mentioning those ones. And someone has seen, Paul has seen in France, relooking. We do use relooking a lot as well.
Sorry, the signal broke up there.
Relooking. French people use the word relooking. When you pay a specialist to help you dress up and do all of that. So I think we've lost your camera, but we can hear you.
Good, yeah. No, French in particular, every time I go to France, I am blown away by the number of Anglicisms which are used by not just younger people all over the place. And I learned French from my father, who was a professor of French, who did his doctorate at the Sorbonne before the war, and who had, I think he had assumed very easily the mantle of the, if you like, the protection of the inheritance of the beautiful French language. And it actually hurts me to hear a lot of his Anglicisms in French in nowadays, and I wish they wouldn't do it.
It's going to be hard to stop. I think Matthias has shared in the chat, for those who are interested, a list of English fun language facts as well, which will complement your presentation. We do have a question from Linda. Can you comment on the influence of the compilation of the Oxford English Dictionary in 1857, please?
The Oxford started then with Murray. Oh, good, we're back again.
Yeah.
And he laboured for many, many years. The first volume of his dictionary didn't come out till 1926. But that was a historical dictionary, which is different. In other words, it lists every word that has ever been part of English, together with its history. And so it's a rather different sort of dictionary, but it has become, in itself, I think, a monument to the, if you like, the accumulation of English over the years. For a long time, it was very much an English dictionary, a British English dictionary. But in 1828, Webster did his dictionary of American English. And in it, he corrected a lot of spellings, like plough was OW and theatre was ER and so on, and moving away from British patterns. So if you like, the norms of English began to diverge very, very strongly in 1828 and have been doing so ever since. What is now happening, of course, is that Mr. Macron has suggested that French should be much more porous at the edges, particularly when it's looking at the influence of France overseas. I'm going to watch this with fascination, because the Academy is now going to have to pick up the mandate given to them by the President. I doubt if you could actually say, well, no, thank you, we don't like that. But how they're going to do it is going to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, we do have a question from John talking about that, which says, how far do you think the guardians of the French language at the Academy will listen to Macron?
I think they will be obliged to, because in terms of their statute, the President of the Republic is the President of the Academy. There will be some pushback, and I think quite rightly so, because there are people who criticize the president for using far too much English and not only bottom up. That said, I think that strategically, the president has got a pretty clear idea that French has a lot of territory which it can begin to reclaim, particularly in the post-British EU, and that there are ways in which France can invent and exercise roles which would be extremely valuable to the language and to the very long history which is part of the French language. There you go.
All right, and I've got a question from Matthias, because he's always teasing us with interesting questions. What was the weekend called before 1926, Rolly?
Fin de semaine.
Fin de semaine.
Yes, but as a tradition, you know, when people didn't work and came together and so on, that was a rather an Anglo-Saxon invention, which has been taken over by many other countries.
Okay, well, that sounds really good. I think you've been receiving a lot of compliments, Rolly, about your presentation. Lots of thank you, excellent presentation. We've even got a nice message from Jane with my equivalent of the Melbourne French Festival. So there's people watching from all over Australia and probably Brilliant. France as well in replay. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send them now. Otherwise, I think we may have to call it an end. We do have other webinars coming up. This is the first of a series of 17 webinars. Tonight, we will be receiving Karen Viggers, who is an Australian author. She will be interviewed by Jacques from Le Van du Livre. This will be an interesting conversation because Karen has been successful selling her books in Australia, but also in France, probably for different reasons. So I don't know if you have read the books, but I'm sure you will after you hear from her. More compliments. Many thanks to Rolly. This has been a highlight of my day. That's wonderful. I think we may close on that one. All right.
Thanks, Betty.
Do you have anything you'd like to share with our audience today?
Well, I would encourage everybody to get on the web and go looking for Académie Française Macron 2018 Discours. It's a really interesting piece of thinking about the way in which you can reposition a language in the 21st century, apart from which it is written in the most exquisitely beautiful French, and which gives me great pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. And I earnestly invite everybody to join both the rest of the webinars and the Alliance's Festival of the French Film, which is going to start again tomorrow. Australians love things French, and come and enjoy them.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just want to add that the Brisbane French Festival has been postponed. So as you probably know by now, we will not be in Musgrave Park next week, but we will be in Musgrave Park on the 16th, 17th and 18th of October. So we will be sending you an email tomorrow with more information. But if you would like to help the festival as well, you're more than welcome to send us a small donation to make it happen. We're trying to survive this very strange year. Okay, thank you very much, Rolly, for your time. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.